As scale increases, the potential for asymmetry increases. And as the asymmetry increases, the asymmetric warfare gets more difficult to deal with. So let's think about this in terms of market theory. Let's think about an early hypothetical idealized market, like literally people just took their shoes and their cows and their sheep and their service offerings to a market and they looked at exchanging them. And then because trading cows for chickens is hard, we have some kind of currency to mediate a barter of goods and services. But we're talking about real goods and services. Maybe there's 2 people, maybe there's 5 people that sell shoes. There's not 5,000 of them. And I can go touch the shoes myself. I can talk with them. I can see what the price is. And there is no hypernormal stimuli of advertising. It's like somebody yelling from his thing. So there's a symmetry between the supply and the demand side, right? The supply side is a guy or a few guys selling something, and the demand side is a person or a family trying to buy something, and they can kind of tell each other's bullshit to some degree of symmetry. Buyer beware becomes an important idea. But now when this becomes Nike and then still one person, there's still a symmetry between supply and demand in aggregate, meaning the total amount of money flowing into supply equals the total amount flowing out of demand, but this side is coordinated and this side isn't. You don't have something like a labor union on all purchasers, where it's like all Facebook users are part of some union that puts money together to counter Facebook and lobbying and regulation. You have Facebook as like a close to $1 trillion organization against me as a person. And I'm still the same size person that I was in those early market examples, but there wasn't like $1 trillion organization. And now, when that happens, manufactured demand kills market theory and classical market theory, which is the idea of why a market is like evolution, right? It's like some evolutionary process, is that the demand is based on real people wanting things that will actually enhance the quality of their life. And so that creates an evolutionary niche for people to provide supply, and then the rational actor will purchase the good or service at the best price and of the best value. But of course, as soon as we get to a situation where, and you look at Dan Ariely and all the behavioral economics saying the homo economicus, the rational actor, doesn't exist. We end up making choices based on status that's conferred with a brand, based on the compellingness of the marketing, based on all kinds of things that are not the best product or service at the best price. But you also get that I want stuff that will not increase the quality of my life. I desperately want shit because the demand was manufactured into me. So it's not an emergent, authentic demand that represents collective intelligence. It's a supply side saying, I want to get them to want more of my shit. And I actually have the power to do that using applied psychology, like actual. And as soon as you get to split testing and the ability to AI split test a gazillion things, we're talking about radically scientifically optimized psychological manipulation for the supply side to create artificial demand and then be able to fulfill it. And most of that ends up being of the type that is actually bad for the quality of the life of the people, but you have the plausible deniability. They're choosing it. Hey, I don't want to be patriarchal and control what they're doing. The people are choosing it. I'm just offering the source of supply that they're wanting. Bullshit. That's like offering crack to kids. And then when they come back for more of it, like saying, hey, so that was one of the threads I wanted to address.
Well, I love it. Back in must have been 2013 when Game B was actually a group of people who met in a room and talked about things. One of the points that I was making in that context was this inherent asymmetry around unionization, and that the problem is unions have gotten a bad rap because of the tight association cognitively that we have with labor unions, right? We think of unions and labor unions as synonymous, but union is actually a category. It's potentially a very large category, and effectively, management always has the benefit of it. The question is, will workers have a symmetrical entity, right? That's the labor case. But you can make the same case with respect to, banking. Credit unions don't work. They're very bank-like. But if they were structured in such a way to actually, unionize people who utilize the bank, could be highly effective, could be a complete replacement for the insurance industry, which doesn't even make sense in a market context. But as a risk pool, you could do a very effective job. So anyway, yes, the question is, how do you scale up the collective force, and especially how do you do it in light of the fact that the entities that are already effectively unionized see it coming and they disrupt it with all of their very powerful tools. And so, anyway, go ahead.
I want to say the beginning of an answer to that, because I think it brings us to what you've been largely exploring in this show of late, of the breakdown of democracy and open society, and what do we do about that, and how that relates to breakdown in culture and breakdown in market. We can look at those, the relationship between those three types of entities. So a way of thinking about what the architectural idea of a liberal democracy is, and why, say, the founders of this country set it up not as a pure laissez-faire market, but as a state that had regulatory power and a market together, was the idea is that a market will provision lots of goods and services better than a centralized government will. So let's leave the market to do the kind of provisioning of resource and innovation that it does well. But the market will also do a couple really bad things. It will lead to increasing asymmetries of wealth inexorably. This is what Piketty's data showed, but it's just obvious. Having more money increases your capacity to have access to financial services, and you make interest on debt and on compounding interest on wealth. And so you end up getting a power law distribution of wealth. So then a few people in just the market dynamic would be able to have way outsized control over everyone else against everyone else's interests. And the market creates opportunities for things that are really bad. We all know that, like, we want there to be a thing called crime where where even though there's a market incentive for child sex trafficking and whatever else, we say, no, we're going to create some rule of law that binds that thing and not just have market drive it. So the idea is that we create a state that we actually give a monopoly of violence to. So it has even more power at the bottom of the stack of what power is than the top of the economic power law distribution. So the wealthiest people and the wealthiest corporations will still be bound by this rule of law. And the rule of law is an encoding of the collective ethics of the people, right? The ethics are the basis of jurisprudence. And there is some kind of democratic process of getting to say, what is it that we consider the good life and important that we want enshrined in rule of law? We give that a monopoly of violence. And really then the goal of the state is to bind the predatory aspects of market incentive while leaving the market to do the things that it does well. But pretty much every law is where someone has an incentive to do something, which is a market type dynamic that is bad for the whole enough that we make a law to bind it. Okay, so the purpose of a state is to bind the predatory aspects of a market. That only works as long as the people bind the state. And the people bind the state if you have a government of, for, and by the people, of an educated populace who had a quality of education that were capable of understanding all the issues upon which we are governing and making law, and a fourth estate where the news that they are getting is of adequate quality and unbiased enough that they're informed about what's currently happening. If you think about that, that's what a republic would require. And you realize that both public education and the fourth estate have eroded so badly for so long. It's not that we're close to losing our democracy. It's dead. We don't have a republic. We have a permanent political class and a permanent economic lobbying class. And the people who aren't really actively engaged in government in any way at all, beyond maybe jury duty now and again if they can't get out of it. And if the people, to be engaged in government in any meaningful way, had to tell the DOE what they think should be done about grid security and energy policy, or tell the DOD what should be done about nuclear first strike policy, or tell the Fed and Treasury what they think about interest rates, they have no fucking idea how to have a governance of, for, and by the people. They don't have that education. They don't have the media basis. So if the people can't check the state, then the state will end up getting captured by the market. And so you'll end up having the head of the FDA be someone who ran a big drug or a big ag company and the head of the DoD being somebody who ran Lockheed or some military industrial complex manufacturer. You'll have just lobbying, just straightforward lobbying gets paid for by somebody. Who's it get paid for? Those who have the money to pay for lots of lobbyists. And so then you end up getting a crony capitalist structure, which is worse than just an evil market, because now it has the regulatory apparatus of rule of law and monopoly of violence backing up the market type, the dynamics. So then we say, okay, well, what do we do here? And we see that civilizations fail towards either oppression or chaos, right? Those are the two fail states. They fail towards oppression if trying to create some coherence happens through a top-down forcing function. They fail towards chaos if not having enough top-down forcing function, everybody kind of believes whatever they want, but they have no unifying basis for belief. And so then they will end up going into, they'll balkanize, they'll tribalize, and then the tribal groups will fight against each other. If you don't want to, so either we keep failing towards chaos, which we can see is happening in the West and in the US in particular right now. And then China, which is happy to do the oppression thing, and oppression beats chaos in war, right? Because it has more ability to execute effectively, which is why China has built high-speed trains all around the world when we haven't built a single one in our country. So either we lose to China in the 21st century and oppression runs the 21st century, or we beat China at being China, meaning beat it at oppression, or it's like, fuck, those are both failure modes. What is there other than oppression or chaos is order that is emergent, not imposed, which requires a culture of people who can all make sense of the world on their own and communicate effectively to have shared sense making as a basis for shared choice making. The idea of an open society is that some huge number of people can all make choices together, a huge number of people who see the world differently and are anonymous to each other, not a tribe. That was an Enlightenment era idea, right? Born out of the idea that we could all make sense of the world together, born out of the philosophy of science and the Hegelian dialectic, that we could make sense of base reality and that we could make sense of each other's perspective, dialectic, find a synthesis, and then be able to have that be the basis of governance. So what I think is this is not an adequate long-term structure, because we can talk about why tech has made nation-state democracies obsolete, and it's just not obvious yet, but it has. But as an intermediate structure, the reboot of the thing that was intended has to start at the level of the people, at culture, and at collective sense-making and collective good faith dialogue, because without that, you can't bind state. Without that, you can't bind market incentive.
Okay, I love this riff of yours. Okay, I think there's a tremendous amount that's really important, and the synthesis is super tight. I know people will have a little bit of trouble following it, but I actually would advise them to go back through it and listen to it again, because it's right on the money as far as I'm concerned. There's one place where I wonder if it doesn't have two things inverted.
Okay.
So you talk about the two characteristics that are necessary in order for, what did you call it? Liberal democracy, or whatever it was that you used as a moniker, to function. One of them had to do with the idea that the state was big enough to bind the most powerful and well-resourced actors. And the second was that the people have to be capable of binding the state. Now, I understood you to say that what failed first was the people's ability to bind the state. Is that correct?
I'm saying that's at the foundation of the stack that we have to address. The failure was recursive.
So, as I see it, what happened was the power, the fact that there is always corruption, it's impossible to drive it out completely. The corruption self-enlarges the loopholes and becomes subtle enough that it's hard to see directly. The most powerful actors suddenly got an infusion of power, and we could trace down the cause of it. But let's just say somewhere in recent history, the most powerful actors became more powerful than the state. And what they did with that power was they unhooked the ability of the state to regulate the market. I believe the reason for this was that each individual industry had an interest in having its regulations removed in order to create a bigger slice of the pie for it. And so effectively what you had was each industry agreeing to unregulate every other industry. Like, you can unregulate, if I'm a pharmaceutical company, right, and you're an oil company, and you want to make money, but you have to be able to fuck up the atmosphere to do it. And I want to make money giving people drugs that they shouldn't have, and corrupting the FDA. Then we'll partner. And so what you got was many industries partnering to unhook the ability of the state to bind the market. But one of the things that they had to do in order to make that work was they had to eliminate the ability of the people to veto. Right? And so this is where we get this incredibly toxic duopoly that pretends to do our bidding and pretends to be, fiercely opposed, the two sides of it. But in fact, the thing they're united about is not allowing something else to compete with them for power. So it's, the wolf in sheep's clothing is in charge of the thing that is supposed to be protecting us from wolves. In any case, we don't have to go too deep there, but
no, this is actually super important.
Go for it.
This is related to the thing we said about, as the market as a whole gets bigger, then the individual consumer stays an individual consumer, but the supply side, the company, gets much larger. As that happens, the asymmetry of the war between them, of the game theory between them, gets larger, and so manufactured demand becomes a more intense thing. Well, the same thing is true in terms of the market capacity to influence the government and the market government complex's capacity to keep the population from getting in the way of the extraction. And so there's a heap of mechanisms that happen. And there's not like 5 guys at the top who are coordinating all this. It's a shared attractor or incentive landscape that orients it.
Yeah, largely emergent.
Yeah. And where there are people conspiring, it's because there's shared incentive and capacity to do so. So the conspiracy is itself an emergent property of the incentive dynamics, which then in turn doubles down on the types of incentive dynamics that make things like that succeed.